All right, I think we're just about ready to get started here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Camille. If you don't know me, I've worked here at Schnard's for almost 2 years now. Usually I am taking care of honeybees, but I'm also dipping into the mason bees as well. I've done a couple of videos in the past on mason bee care, mason bee release, things like that. So now we're going to move on into mason bee harvest. It's getting into October now. We are sitting at the 17th, so now is a great time to get that harvest started. So before we really get started in the October harvest, I'm going to do a quick season recap, just kind of let everybody know what has happened or what should have happened throughout the mason bee year. Mid-February to April 1st, we'll be actively releasing. Your release conditions, of course, you want to put your mason bees out when it's about 55 degrees. You want a good 3 days without any rain so your mason bees can begin to emerge and they can actually fly around and get some food. Once they hatch, they're really going to need to re-up on the pollen and nectar because they've been sitting in those cocoons for all winter and they're basically out of stores at that point. Blooming flowers within 100 feet of your nesting area. The mason bees aren't going to fly too far from where they've nested. They're going to want to return and they're going to heavily pollinate a very small area. Your mason bee spring care. This is from the date of release through late May. This is when your mason bees are active. They're out, they're flying around. There are certain things that you need to provide for them. They're going to need their nectar and their pollen resources, so plenty of flowers in the area. Fruit trees are great, early flowering things, snowdrops, things like this. They're going to need water, active water around their nest. So it's a good idea to put a little saucer full of rocks and some water in there so that they can easily drink right next to their nest. Clay mud is also very important for your mason bees to actually be able to nest. If they have a lot of hard-packed dry clay, they're not really going to be able to use that. And if they can't find any clay mud, they will vacate the nest area and you'll wind up with nothing in your house. So nice wet clay mud is an absolute must for them. Wind protection near the entrance of your mason bee house is ideal. If the mason bees have a hard time flying into their nesting holes, they may just move elsewhere. And mason bee block placement is really important as far as pest protection. So if you put it down too low, you may have problems with skunks or animals that are a little bit lower down to the ground. Ants and birds can be a problem as well. There are certain things like screens or mesh that you can put across the top of the block, which will help with the birds. And mason bee gestation, which we've just basically finished with here, is June 1st through late September. A lot of people take their mason bee blocks out of their houses and put them into a paper bag or a mesh bag and put them in the garage or somewhere nice and warm where they can continue gestation and be much safer from pests and things. Not 100% necessary. You can leave your mason bee nesting block as it is. But when you do harvest in October, there's going to be quite a bit more pests in there. Not necessarily even just for the mason bees, but for the beekeeper as well. You're going to find all sorts of things have moved in. There's spiders. It's just better to put them inside. All right, moving past the recap here, the October cocoon harvest. So mason bees are now fully developed in their cocoons. They could hatch out right now and they would be an actual bee. This is called the imago stage. So it's safe to harvest them for winter storage. They're fully bees. Harvesting involves several things, but basically what you're doing is you're removing the cocoons and you're cleaning them. So depending on if you have paper tubes or wood blocks, harvesting is going to be a little bit different. You can clean cocoons with a bleach solution or a clean bee solution, which is a little spray that comes from crown bees. They both work just fine, but bleach seems to be a cheaper solution and it's readily available. So I'd recommend using the bleach. It's important to rinse and dry your cocoons. You can either dry your cocoons just letting them sit, or you can pat them dry with paper towels. Obviously, you don't want a bunch of empty or infested cocoons in your fridge throughout the entire season, so you'd be discarding any unsuccessful cocoons and storing them through winter. So why do we harvest? It seems a pretty natural question. Well, they're native, so why don't we just let them do what they're going to do? It's because humans have intervened, of course. Mason bees are solitary bees, and usually they're scattered in nature. You're not going to find a whole block full of hundreds and hundreds of bees in any one place. This is a human construct. And because they're in such dense locations, it's kind of like a city. Pests are going to be much more common, and they're going to have a much easier time getting at all of the mason bees. Cleaning mason bee habitats for next year. So this is really important because the more pests get into your mason bee blocks, the easier it is going to be for them to flourish. And once you have pests flourishing in your mason bee blocks, you're going to have fewer mason bees successfully laying and successfully becoming cocoons and adult bees later on. So clean those mason bee blocks out every year. Now, don't necessarily soak them with water, but just make sure you get a nice brush and you clean them out. So harvesting also raises your survival rates for next year's batch. When you use the bleach bath, you will get rid of fungal and disease pests. So you are ridding the mason bees of foul brood, you're getting rid of pollen mites, you're getting rid of just anything that would impede the mason bees' adaptability. And you're also controlling your hatching times in spring. Depending on the weather, mason bees may hatch out earlier or later, which could be a good or a bad thing. But if you're looking for specific pollination, say you have cherry trees and they're really early, you want your mason bees to come out with the cherry trees, you can control when your mason bees are going to hatch by keeping them in the refrigerator over winter and releasing them when it's a good time and when the flowers are actually out. So a couple of supplies for harvesting. There are several ways of doing this. You may use some or all of these tools. You may have other tools that you find useful as well. But we would use bleach, a water source. You can use your sink as long as the water's not too warm. You can also use your garden hose, a sheet pan for collecting your cocoons, a colander because you're going to need to be rinsing them and getting rid of any small particles that need to be cleaned off, paper towels for drying them, your humidity or another storage container. A sandwich container works just fine as long as there's air holes in it and you can contain the right humidity in there. Your mason bee block and tubes, of course. You'll need an instrument for removing the cocoons, particularly for wood blocks. You can use your fingers. The cocoons are pretty tough, so if you pry on them a little bit, it's not going to hurt them. But some people prefer to use the back end of a spoon, or Crown Bee also makes a specific tool called a bee comb that will scrape out 5 or 6 cocoons in a row. And then you're going to need a container for bathing your cocoons in the bleach water as well. So mason bee habitats, you may be harvesting from one or both or several different habitats. Some people have wood blocks. You can use them year after year. They're super easy to harvest from. They're easy to clean. The paper tubes are great as well. You can reuse the cardboard outer tubes every year. You do have to purchase the paper tubes every year though, because you are going to be destroying those when you're harvesting. Some people may also have natural reeds. This is totally fine, and they're pretty easy to harvest from as well. They're brittle and they're easy to break apart. Commercially made mason bee houses that have bamboo in them rather than natural reeds are almost impossible to harvest from. It's still possible, but we're definitely not recommending them because a lot of times the bamboo is not only difficult to harvest from, but it's also glued to the house itself, which makes harvest very difficult, if not impossible. So from here on, I'm going to be separating harvesting into wood blocks and paper tubes, just for simplicity's sake. So with the wood blocks, usually you're going to have blocks with a cardboard backing like this and large rubber bands like this going all around. You'll take off the rubber bands and the backing. The backing is just to prevent pests from coming into the backside. It kind of covers up those holes. And then from there, it's pretty easy to separate your blocks to get into your mason bees. And like I said before, you can use your fingers or you can use a tool of your choice to scoop out the cocoons and put them onto your sheet pan. Screwdrivers work really well also. They seem to be the right size. And paper tubes, a little bit different, but also pretty simple. You're going to remove all your cardboard protective tubes and you can set those aside so that you can use them next year. The cardboard tubes are mainly for protecting against mono wasps. It gives an extra layer so that the ovipositor of the mono wasp can't penetrate as effectively, and you'll save quite a few mason bee cocoons that way. The white paper tubes usually peel pretty easily. They're essentially paper straws. So take the edge and just unwind. If they don't peel all that easily, luckily mason bee cocoons are waterproof. So you can soak them in tepid or kind of cool water for about 10 minutes, and that'll loosen the paper to where it'll basically just fall apart. It is important that you use room temperature or cool water, because if you use warm water, that's going to give the mason bees the idea that it is time to hatch, and hatching mason bees is not what we're going for right now. You are going to see a lot of mess in with your mason bee cocoons, which is not a huge problem. All these black pellets you see, they're not any sort of pest. They're just mason bee frass or poop. So if you see large amounts of black pellets, not to worry there. You are going to see quite a few other things in here as well. Summer bee larvae can be pretty common. They are pretty large larvae and they're kind of yellow. So you can save these and put them back into your blocks once you're done. If you have tubes, maybe you have a couple of extra left over and you can kind of put those back in. No guarantee that they're going to live, but definitely do put them back out there and give them a chance. Pollen mites are usually pretty common. In the place of a mason bee cocoon, you're going to see a mass of kind of a yellowish substance. The pollen mites are near microscopic, and they essentially don't hurt the mason bee at all physically. They will just eat all of its food and hence starve the mason bee larva out. Houdini flies are going to be in the larval stage when you are harvesting. So just set these aside. You can kind of leave them in the bleach water. They are definitely a pest, and they will do the same thing as the pollen mites. They'll eat all of the mason bee's food that the mother has stocked up and essentially starve them out. Carpet beetles I haven't run into too much, but you may see those in there as well. And same thing, we're trying to strain those out. We're trying to get rid of those and keep just the mason bees. Predation from mono wasp, you can actually see this pretty easily if you are harvesting from tubes. It's not going to be as easy to tell from blocks, but it's still possible. If you have your paper tube, you can kind of hold it up to the light and you'll see little tiny holes all along the end of it. You can fit a paper clip into these holes. It's just about the right size. And that's a sign that a mono wasp has laid its eggs in your cocoon, and the mono wasp has effectively eaten the larva. Fungal chalk brood is another common one. This is something that can easily be gotten rid of through your bleach bath. So let's get on to the bleach bath itself. Now that you've harvested all of your cocoons, you've put them into your sheet pan, transfer all of the cocoons themselves into the colander, and we're going to wash them out. Again, use cool water, not warm. Use warm water, you may have hatchings. Garden hoses are fine, sinks are fine, whatever makes you most comfortable. It is going to make a bit of a mess, so just keep that in mind. You want all the mud and debris and frass and everything to fall away. You want to be left with basically just mason bee cocoons that you're now soaking and rinsing. Your solution of bleach water should be pretty mild. You're going to use about a tablespoon of bleach to a gallon of water. And you only want to soak those for about 3 minutes. You might want to use a glove for this or a spoon or something, but make sure you get full coverage on your mason bees. You want the cocoon to be completely washed off with the bleach water, and that's going to get rid of lots of different things. It's going to kill any remaining pollen mites. It's going to get rid of any chalk brood on there. It's important that once you do rinse your mason bees in your bleach solution, that you do rinse them again in clean water. So you can use a spray on your garden hose or your sink, or you can rinse them in an actual clean water bath as well. But when you're finished with that, just make sure you pat them dry or let them air dry, roll them around a little bit. You don't want to put wet cocoons into the fridge. And clean bee spray. Crown Bee makes a spray that uses hypochlorous acid, which it's a natural acid and can be a little bit safer than bleach if you're concerned about having kids or pets around. This may be something that you'd be interested in. It's really easy to use. You just spray it all over the cocoon. It is a little bit more expensive though. So that's why I typically go with the bleach solution instead. So your storage parameters for actually overwintering your bees. You do have a little bit of wiggle room here, but you're going to want temperatures of 36 to 39 degrees. So your refrigerator at home is pretty on point with temperature. The humidity is something that we're going to be concerned about, however. There are containers called humidibees that we carry in the store that kind of help out with this. So frost-free refrigerators, typically not humid enough. If you have a really old refrigerator, you've got quite a bit of ice on the inside, maybe you don't need the humidity bee, maybe you do or already have the 60% or higher humidity, but most of your modern refrigerators are going to need the added humidity. Homemade containers work great as well. I was mentioning earlier a sandwich container. If you have a little plastic box, you can poke a couple holes in there. You do need the mason bee cocoons to be able to breathe. So if you have a refrigerator, say out in your garage that you don't open very often, make sure you go in there and you just fan the door once or twice a month so that they do get some fresh air in there as well. Mason bees can suffocate if you don't open them up too often. And about once a week, kind of coincides with just opening and airing them out. Make sure your humidity levels are remaining consistent. If you have put a tablespoon of water into with your humidity, that's going to eventually evaporate and you're going to have to refresh it now and then. So the Bee Buyback Program, kind of a cool program set up by Crown Bee. If you have way too many mason bee cocoons, honestly, the best thing you can do with it is share with your friends. It's great teaching them. It's a good activity for kids as well. But if you have way too many, you can send them in to Crown Bee. They offer a buyback program. I think they'll give you 5 cents on the cocoon, depending on whether or not it has been harvested or if it's still in the tubes. And I will insert a link down here in the chat. A couple little extra bits of information here. The Bee Buyback Program is in there as well. Dave Hunter, the owner of Crown Bee, has some excellent walkthroughs as well. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to demonstrate actually harvesting any cocoons because I don't actually have any this year. My neighbor is quite fond of birds and bird feeders, so didn't have too much luck this year, unfortunately. So I know that was a bit of a short video there, but if you guys have any questions, I'd like to open it up right now. Feel free to unmute yourself and see if we've got any questions I can answer.
I don't have any questions. This is Eric. Just wanted to say this is a great presentation. Really enjoy all the webinars. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. Much appreciated.
I have a question.
Ask if you can be heard.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned your neighbor had bird feeders, and so you didn't get many cocoons. What's the relationship between the bird feeders and the bees? We have bird feeders in our backyard.
So if you have bird feeders in your backyard, mason bees in your front yard, you may have a little bit more success. I had my mason bee feeder on the south side of my house, and my neighbor only had a fence separating my mason bee house from his bird feeder. So they were basically in direct line with my house. I didn't notice this until quite a bit later, so unfortunately didn't catch it quite in time. But mason bees are an excellent snack for birds. So maybe they're out foraging, maybe they're trying to get back into their house, but the birds realize that there's a bunch of mason bees around, and well, it's kind of a smorgasbord.
I see.
So you can tell if your bees have been victimized by birds because they'll have pecked holes in the mud casing in the box.
Not necessarily. I mostly noticed that there was just an absence of mason bees filling my nesting holes. All of them had hatched successfully. I still have quite a few of them in here. I don't know if you can really see, but I have several mason bee cocoons here that have emerged, but they either flew the coop or they were eaten. I had plenty of mud, I had plenty of water, lots of flowers around. So the resources were there. I'm just assuming that they had been predated on.
Where did you buy that? So unfortunately, we bought a cute little nesting box from Fred Meyer's, and it is bamboo and unremovable stuff. You know, it's just totally the wrong thing, it sounds like. But any tips about what we could try to do?
There are a couple things you can do, actually. Sometimes the paper tubes will fit inside those tubes, and you can harvest at least some of them. My recommendation is, if it's possible, maybe you can break out those bamboo tubes and then you can fill it with paper tubes instead. Because those bamboo tubes are still going to be a vector for all sorts of pests to come and move in.
Right. So as far as this year's crop of bees, though, they're pretty much a loss, would you say?
Mine in particular, yes. Not necessarily everyone's. If you had yours in particular, your bamboo, you may be able to harvest some of them. What I'd recommend is taking some pruners, some shears, and chopping the first 1/4 inch or so of the bamboo. See if you can peel it back a little bit. You may be able to get some cocoons out of there.
Okay.
And if we can't do that and we just leave the house out for the winter, I mean, is there any chance that the bees will survive and come out, or how can we maximize that possibility?
Particularly in the first year, you're probably going to have some pretty good success. The second year and third year, you're going to have a much greater population of pests and a much less population of mason bees themselves.
Right. So yeah, I guess for next year we'll get the tubes or the blocks, but for the ones that we have now in this bamboo box, it looks like they have a lot of bees, sealed them up with mud. So should we leave that outdoors? Should we put it in the garage? What should we do with that to maximize the chances of the bees surviving and coming out in the spring?
Since you aren't able to actually harvest them, I would probably just leave them as they are. They will naturally emerge when temperatures rise above 50 to 55 degrees. It stops raining. If they see cocoons ahead of them emerging, there's light filtering in towards their cocoons. That's another signal that they are ready to emerge. So they'll kind of do their natural thing the first year. But as the years go by, you're going to see much less productivity as mason bees go.
Right.
So as far as leaving them outside, would you say the humidity is high enough during the rainy season?
Definitely.
Yeah.
You may have a little bit of time where it's going to be dried out, but the Oregon winters are usually pretty moist.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be too worried about it.
Yeah.
It's
So
mostly just the refrigerators get particularly dry, so that's why the humidity is
Right.
really concerned.
great. Well, we'll leave them sit and get back to you next year about how well it worked.
All right, I'll definitely be interested to hear.
Camille, I think that we're sort of in the same boat. I think we have a similar house to this couple here. If we are able to harvest though the cocoons, how do we just leave the container out and they'll just hatch and come out, or do we have to put them back in the tubes, the cocoons? Like, how do we do that in the spring?
So in the spring, when you are getting ready to put your mason bees back out, if you have a mason bee house and a block, it's easy. What you do is this goes into a house casing, and it'll have like a little roof and things like that. You can put your mason bees just directly on top of your tubes, and there's actually a little groove at the top here. As long as they're kind of protected and they have a small entrance where they can leave, then they will hatch out and do their own thing naturally. If you have a small sandwich box or something like you overwintered them in, as long as the hole is large enough that a mason bee can emerge, that's a great idea as well. Protect them from wind, protect them from pests, so hence the really small hole. You don't want birds to be able to get in there and just eat the cocoons before they have a chance to hatch.
Thanks,
How big a
Camille.
hole does a mason bee need?
I believe it is about 8 millimeters, and then
Okay.
leaf cutters are 6 millimeters.
Can it get
And
too
you'll see the
wet?
males emerging first. They're a little bit smaller.
Wet in here in Oregon for them? Like, could there be too much rain, or do we need to shelter them from the rains here in Oregon during the winter at all?
Your box should be sufficient enough to keep the rain off, but if you are having trouble with sideways rain, if your mason bee block is becoming moist and moldy, maybe put a side panel on there so that the rain doesn't get in quite as much, but they should be fine out there.
This is Steve. Thank you for the presentation. I have multiple houses. Do you have a recommendation on the max number of paper tubes I should put in each house or location?
I think Dave Hunter from Crown Bees usually recommends getting as many cocoons as you have nesting holes. So a female mason bee will typically fill up 1 to 2 tubes, sometimes 2.5. And you're not going to have 100% of your mason bees hatch out, and some of them are going to be males as well. So it's a good idea to get as many mason bee cocoons as you have holes, and then you'll wind up filling most of those.
If I have, let's say, 200 mason bees, can I put 100 in 2 locations, or do I need to put 50 in 4 locations and kind of spread them out?
If you have multiple blocks, you can definitely do that. Your concern with having too many mason bees is they do have a pretty small area where they're going to forage when they're in their active stage. So within about 100 feet is where they're going to want to stay. If you have a finite amount of flowers in that area, maybe you want to think about spreading them out a little bit. But if you have, say, an orchard and you're trying to pollinate all of your cherry blossoms or your apple blossoms or something like that, then I don't think numbers are really a concern because there's just so much availability of nectar and pollen.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, well, I think I'm going to call it for the morning. I'm going to post this video later on YouTube, on our Chenard's YouTube page, so you can definitely come back and get a refresher if you need. Also, send me an email, give me a call, or visit me in the store if you've got any other questions. And thanks everybody for joining. Have a great morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.